Hello and welcome back to the Elements of Deep Sea Mining. I'm Eric Young. Before we dive into today's conversation with Scott Vincent from the Critical Ocean Minerals Resource Center, just a quick bit of housekeeping. First, a huge thanks to everyone who's been following this podcast. If you have feedback or guest recommendations, I want to hear from you. Please don't hesitate to reach out to me at eric.young@sintef.no. You can find that email in the show notes. I've been receiving valuable feedback, particularly around the importance of challenging my guests when they make claims or assertions that some listeners may find contentious or unsupported. I appreciate this input and am actively working on finding the right balance, something you'll hear me try and perhaps not succeed at navigating in today's episode. I considered whether to edit some of it out, but decided to leave it in, and you can hear me awkwardly struggle with this. So it's something I'm working at improving. At the same time, part of my goal with this podcast is to provide a space where we can genuinely hear and consider viewpoints outside of our usual echo chambers. I'm not interested in disagreeing with my guests, but in understanding why they have arrived at their conclusions. Deep sea mining is a controversial issue that involves a lot of different stakeholders. It's an international issue, and no one set of people is going to decide what happens in this space. So it isn't about winning an argument, because you'll never convince everybody, and the ocean is a big place. I believe strongly that the best outcomes will come from discussion and understanding. This requires cognitive empathy, really knowing why other people hold the opinions they do, and maybe even seeing that if you were in their position, you might also think that way. So the goal of this podcast, in addition to providing as much information about deep sea mining as possible, is to give people from different perspectives an opportunity to explain their position and to give you a chance to hear and consider those positions. So please don't just listen to the guests that you already agree with, but try to also hear the voices that you disagree with. On that note, I've also heard from listeners asking for more guests from certain areas, guests from kind of different sectors, and to that I just say, please stay tuned. I've got marine biologists and experts from different geographical regions lined up to broaden the conversation. If you've got particular people you'd like to hear from or topics you'd like covered, then please send me a message. Okay, maybe that's enough moralizing for one episode. On to today's guest. Scott Vincent is an investor and advocate for deep sea mining who established the Critical Ocean Minerals Resource Center to counteract narratives he sees as misleading about the potential benefits and risks of seabed resource extraction. Scott brings a wealth of experience from the investment world and is very knowledgeable and articulate on many aspects of DSM.
Speaking as an investor here, people on the outside can, yap all they want about the fact that this can not be economic, but it's really the people who put their money to work here who have a lot of information about the economics of these projects, because that decides whether or not that ship gets built and whether that harvester gets put to work on the bottom of the ocean.
I enjoyed this conversation and I learned a lot talking with Scott, and I hope that you do also. Without further ado, here's my conversation with Scott Vincent. Okay, welcome to the Elements of Deep Sea Mining. Scott Vincent, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Eric. Look forward to the conversation.
So, can we start off with you telling the listener who you are, where you come from, who's the human being behind the opinions, and how you ended up focusing on deep sea mining?
Yeah, for sure. Some people will find my opinions controversial. Other people's are going to agree vehemently with what we have to say. So I'm an investor first. I've worked my entire career in investing, several investment banks before moving to the buy side. I now work for a private investment office. And this is how I came to develop this interest in deep sea extraction. I started looking at the fields probably 15 years ago or so, with some shallower water deposits. Um, Looked at the entire landscape, actually, eventually looked at all the different types of geologies, ecosystems, developed a pretty good appreciation for what was out there, the types of deposits, the value of the deposits, the sensitivities of the ecosystems where they reside, that kind of thing. Did a lot of work on the subject. At the same time, actually a little bit later, we developed a thesis that battery minerals would be a kind of a choke point for the energy transition, and began investing in battery mineral projects outside of deep sea mining. Lithium, copper, several others. And then those two things converged eventually when the opportunity to look at some of these deep sea projects involving energy minerals came up. And we got interested because, after spending a lot of time researching this and understanding the extraction process, it became pretty clear that polymetallic nodules represented the potential, big win-win for society. And we thought we love, opportunities when, as investors, we can do good while earning good returns at the same time. And, the people that we report to, our investors, like that as well. So we thought, polymetallic nodules offered a really great opportunity for the world, and that got us excited about it. Now, we looked at sulfides, we looked at crusts, we've looked, as I said, at a bunch of shallow water things, but polymetallic nodules by far were the most appealing, both because of the economics and the the polymetallic nature of the deposit. You got about seven metals there that you're taking, but also because they reside in an area that is known for relatively sparse biodiversity and biomass, and also the nodules are relatively easy to take because they're not attached, so you're not using any kind of invasive technique. So even the idea that to call it mining is a misnomer, because there's no digging here. You're literally picking up rocks off the surface of the ocean floor. So to all of us, that spelled a win-win situation, and we've been pretty surprised actually at the way that some of the environmental activists have reacted to the idea that we would take minerals in this manner rather than strip mine under tropical rainforests. So
Yeah.
that's kind of how we came to it.
And how long ago was that? Was that kind of before deep sea mining had really
Uh,
caught the attention of?
yeah. I mean, like I said, we started looking at marine deposits 15 years ago. We started doing work specifically on polymetallic nodules probably 8 years ago. So it's and we saw the need for battery minerals, probably a decade ago. So a lot of that, this was not part of a mainstream conversation for a long time after we started to move down this road. So that's why we were a bit surprised at the way that people have reacted to it. But we can go into it a little bit later. I think there's some there's motivations out there, a lot of them economic, that have gotten in the way of this industry. Entrenched players who don't want to see this industry start.
Yeah, I'm also super interested to get kind of more insight into the role of an investor into this. But also, if you can give us the intro to your organization.
So COMRC, as we call it, Critical Ocean Minerals Research Center. We've got a website, comrc.org. We've got a presence on Twitter. That's really where you'll find most of our reports on our website, and we refer to them on Twitter. COMRC is an outreach effort that really was built, and it's really myself, and then I have some scientific advisors that help me. But I specifically am not looking to operators to fund me, and I talk to the operators because we're investors in a couple of these different operators. But it's clear that they might not agree with everything that I say.
Mm-hmm.
So there is a line there. The website is funded by myself. I have taken donations from a couple friends who are also investors in the sector. But it's a really small scale effort at this point. There's not a lot of money behind this. But anyways, the idea here was that there was a void in the marketplace, and environmental activists had filled that void effectively, and they were putting out a lot of misinformation about deep sea mining, which was really troubling to us and disappointing, because we felt that it really does, or we felt that it did represent the better way forward, and it was disheartening to see that happen. But operators are reticent to get involved in that conversation and go up against NGOs, because NGOs often have really large budgets, like WWF. Some of them are smaller, some of them are larger, but really they see it as not a lot to gain in debating those organizations publicly, because even if they win, they look like a bully.
Mm-hmm.
At COMRC, I have no problem with, I guess, looking like a bully, because there's not a whole lot of downside to me from that. But the reality is that the industry has been bullied by the other side to great effect. We can go into it a little bit later, but the moratorium that they've put on the industry has essentially cut off funding from institutional investors. At least you can still get some mom and pops to put in money in the industry. This has changed recently with the executive order, but they've been effective at putting a lot of I call it propaganda out there, and I've sat in meetings with investors, and they've said, we can't make this investment because it's just too much of a public relations risk. So if you cut off investment to an industry that hasn't even started, then you've cut off lifeblood, and you shut it down. And these environmental organizations know that.
Mm-hmm.
That is their strategy. So it becomes life and death to these small companies that depend on investment dollars to survive, and the NGOs cut that off. And so the argument that is made to government officials is that this creates a market imperfection, because you can't get capital formation to an industry that needs it to survive, and that imperfection is built around the misinformation that is supplied by these groups. So therefore, you need an executive order that encourages government entities to help provide some means to get financing and accelerate this industry, because otherwise it just won't happen due to that misinformation that's out there.
Is that what
COMRC stands against the misinformation these NGOs provide? We really push back on it, where a lot of the operators can't do that.
Yeah. And just on that executive order, is that where you see the kind of value of that executive order? I haven't actually even read the full text of that, but I took it as kind of saying, okay, there's no real legislative. They haven't said they're going to do anything that wasn't previously legislated with this order. They're just kind of saying this industry has the support, and you see that as just kind of like a moral support for an industry that's struggling.
Signaling value, for sure. Yeah, they're signaling value, and that opens doors for a lot of investors to look at this. But it goes beyond that. I mean, it also opens the doors at financing entities like the Development Finance Corp and the Exim Bank, where they can finally look at these projects and potentially provide government guaranteed sources of funding for capital expenditures, things like that. But perhaps the most important thing is that the Department of Defense it's encouraging the Department of Defense to look real carefully at the idea of using these nodules in the national defense stockpile.
Mm-hmm.
And that solves for one issue that will give some investors heartache or some agita, some worry about the industry, and that you don't have dedicated nodule processing refining capabilities built yet, and it's going to take 5 years probably to get those built out. So having the government there as a purchaser of these nodules is going to be really helpful. Now, nodules can be processed by what we call interim processors in the meantime, but it just won't be done as efficiently as it will when you've optimized your processing for nodules, and that's going to take not only time but pretty large investment dollars to get that home, get that to work. So government offtake is a big lever.
Okay, well that's actually quite clarifying to me, who has kind of looked at that executive order. I've always just kind of wondered what was the real value in that. So there's a couple more kind of concrete values there than I had seen. Okay, so if we can jump straight to my trade-offs question, which I ask everybody, and then that'll allow us to talk a little bit more specifically about the advantages and disadvantages of deep sea mining. But let me ask you abstractly first, how you think about making a decision that involves balancing between benefits and drawbacks of a potential deep sea mining industry, especially when it involves trade-offs across kind of value categories that are difficult to compare, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And I think first, it's really important to note that there are trade-offs. You and I had this discussion before we came on the air, but I think part of the problem with the activist community is they refuse to acknowledge trade-offs. In other words, they refuse to acknowledge that there are not only costs involved in polymetallic nodule harvesting, but also benefits to it. So just acknowledging that is a big deal. You had a woman on recently who came from one of the deep sea mining activist groups, and she talked about scientific advocacy and the need for honesty. And when you read the work that they publish, I just find it to be intellectually dishonest, because nowhere in that work is there any reference to trade-offs. All they do is look at the negatives of polymetallic nodule harvesting. So to use an analogy, that would be like me coming to you, Eric. COVID-19 hits, and someone comes up with a brilliant mRNA vaccine technology, and they want it approved, and you're running the FDA, and I say, Eric, there's substantial here for hundreds of people to die, and this is just scientific advocacy, right? But I'm showing you that this is going to happen. People are going to die because of this vaccine. Other people are going to be made sick. Other people are going to have anaphylactic shock and have adverse reactions. So there's no way that you can allow this vaccine to come forward. And what would you say?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say we've got to put this in. I get your point. We got to put this in the broader context and value the benefits against the costs. But what about when the costs and benefits are like so specifically distinct? Like we're talking about human welfare benefits up against potential risks to unknown ecosystems.
These are still trade-offs. I mean, we're talking about trade-offs, and these are clear trade-offs. So, but the fact that their work doesn't even acknowledge the trade-offs is disturbing to me. It's she said honesty a couple times. Honesty demands that you look at both the costs and the benefits, and it's embedded in the precautionary principle, right? The precautionary principle says that we need to look at the effects of taking the action, the new technology, whatever it is, but also the effects of not taking that action. And when it comes to nodule harvesting, the effect of not taking this action, of not pursuing this technology, is the status quo. And we know for a fact that the status quo is deadly to humans. It causes death. We've already experienced a lot of death already this year as a result of mining and tailings dam failures and things like that. It causes enormous damage to the most endangered and biodiverse ecosystems in the world. Um, and some of these groups will make the argument that when you take polymetallic nodules, well, that's not going to end terrestrial mining. And that's absolutely true, right? We're not saying that it will end terrestrial mining, but it will supplant the need for future terrestrial mining, or it could knock current terrestrial mining of some of those higher cost terrestrial miners offline. So we've seen that over the last couple of years. This is not theoretical, economics. This is, Indonesian mining, nickel mining came online in a big way over the last few years, and it was relatively low cost. And what that did was that put a bunch of, Western, usually Australians, but some in Papua New Guinea, I think as well, higher cost mines out of business as a result. So, and an activist will say, well, how do you know that polymetallic nodule is going to be low cost? Well, I have a lot of confidence that it is, but you don't have to believe me. I mean, if it is low cost, that will happen. If it's not low cost, then it won't happen.
Mm-hmm.
Polymetallic nodule harvesting has to survive just like any other mine has to survive. And if it can't do it at low cost, then it won't come online. So, the argument that activists make that it's not economic, it's not viable, is really just if they truly believe that argument, then they shouldn't be spending their time advocating against deep sea mining, because if it's not economic, it just won't happen. Now, some people will say, now that you have the government subsidizing it, maybe that can make it economic. And that's true. There's truth to that for sure. The only reason the government has to step in here and provide guarantees behind some of these loans is because these NGOs have been so effective in their moratorium that they've created that market imperfection that you and I talked about. So if they didn't plow the market with that misinformation, there wouldn't be the need for creating those subsidies. So anyways, that there is a trade-off there between terrestrial mining and polymetallic nodule harvesting. If in a fixed demand environment, you add supply, price declines, that wipes out the higher cost producers. I mean, this just happened in Australia. We know that it happens in a dynamic environment where demand is growing at a pretty high pace. Then you might not see the decline in price as you bring on new supply. So what happens then is that you obviate the need for new terrestrial supply by answering that demand with polymetallic nodule harvesting. Either way, it's a win for humankind because you have less terrestrial mining going on as a result. It also helps with decarbonization, right? The more abundant we can make these energy minerals, the lower the cost of the energy transition. And also, there is a bit of consumer revolt already happening because these energy transition minerals are coming from places like the DRC and Indonesia, where you have all kinds of human rights violations and just wiping out of the most biodiverse ecosystems in the world. But if you can supplant some of that with energy minerals coming from an area that has very little biodiversity in a relative sense and very little life and really no damage to humanity, well then, you can sell that green transition a little bit easier to consumers.
Yeah, I follow all of that. Let me push back on what I think are the strongest kind of counterpoints to this. So for the one, so you're making the economic claim, which I think is pretty strong, that if deep sea mining isn't going to be economically valuable, then there's nothing to worry about. It'll get tested, but that'll be small scale, and it'll peter out before it can manage to do any of the large scale damage that people are worried about. But along with kind of the problem of imperfect information in the free market is what you do about externalities. So so I guess one problem there is like, okay, deep sea mining might be more economically sound, might be cheaper to get the nickel out, but people are going to push back on the environmental externalities. And in this case, I think the one that people touch on mostly is just here we're talking about unknown ecosystems. And I mean, people on this podcast have kind of pushed back on that, but I just want to give you the opportunity to push back against that argument before we go on to the next one. I guess I'll just put it out there now, which is in terms of the decreasing demand. If you like, I have done some modeling in my master's that the expectation around nickel demand is huge, and there's papers kind of saying, for all of these minerals, nobody thinks that the demand is going to go down. It's only going to go up. So this, like, whether or not we close down existing mines, we're definitely going to need to open new mines. Then the question is where to open them. But I think the strongest counter argument there is that the cheaper you make a mineral, the more we're going to use it. This is kind of the Jevons paradox. And it's like, if we have the price of nickel, then maybe we're all going to be driving Teslas with 600 kilometer range instead of 300 kilometer range, and maybe 300 kilometer range is enough. So take those in whatever order you want, the kind of externalities question or the added consumption.
Yeah, so it's tough to see making energy minerals more abundant and more accessible and cheaper as being a bad thing for society, right? I mean, if we want to transition, if we want to support artificial intelligence so that we can develop better drugs, if we want to make progress as society, generally having abundance in these energy minerals is really important. So it's hard to hear an environmental activist make the argument that decarbonizing faster, reducing our CO2 footprint, reducing our impact on humans and our impact on biodiverse ecosystems is a bad thing. It's just not congruent to me to hear that argument made. There are trade-offs, right? Like you said, and that was the whole point of this question. But I view that as a win for society if you can make these minerals less expensive. We're going to need a lot of them to make this transition. But I also think that this industry is necessary whether the energy transition happens or not, because it's just a cleaner way to bring these minerals to market, regardless of all these other factors. And then to your point about externalities and the unknown, the unknowns in particular, people lean on that unknown argument a lot. The reality is that, first of all, we've been studying impacts from nodule harvesting for over 50 years. So it's not like this is brand new. The metals company, I think alone, has spent $500 million on scientific research over the last decade. So we're not going into this blind, but I'll tell you that, the big unknowns really have to do with, what's down there, right? What organisms are there? How wide do they range? How much impact will this activity have on them? Those same questions are evident in tropical rainforests. In the unknowns there blow away the unknowns at the bottom of the ocean. To be honest with you, there's over 4 million species thought to exist in tropical rainforests, and almost 90% of them are unknown to us. We haven't named them, we haven't characterized them, we don't know how many of them we drive to extinction when we open up new mines. So there's tremendous amount of unknowns involved in terrestrial mining. But more important is what's known, and what's known are these horrific impacts that we have, particularly on people. And to me, the biggest argument here to make for polymetallic nodule harvesting is that we're not going to have the negative impacts on people, the death, the displacement, the disease, nearly to the same extent that you have with terrestrial mining. I mean, there just aren't the pathways to get there. So to me, that's the showstopper. That should end this debate. We can show that, yes, you can supplant terrestrial mining for nodule harvesting. We can show it through examples. We can show it through economic theory. And then we can show that we're not going to do as much damage to humans with this activity. And, the need to kind of weigh human lives more heavily is actually embedded in the precautionary principle as well. So, if we really are to kind of hew to those principles of precaution and making decisions under uncertainty, then we should really, we should live by those principles, right? We should adhere to the precautionary principle and the idea that we should protect human lives, and that matters.
So let me just put some words in your mouth. As far as I've understood this, is you're kind of saying that. I mean, I guess one of the things that I think is interesting in the deep sea mining conversation, similar to the climate change conversation, is that people shift between economic and moral arguments continually, and they blend them together, and it's a mix. But what I'm hearing you say is that in terms of trade-offs, we can divide these things into the different categories. We can compare the economics to economics. We can compare the ecosystem impacts to ecosystem impacts as much as we can. You're saying unknown deep sea ecosystems up against unknown rainforest ecosystems. You're saying we should put the social impacts against the social impacts, try to make some comparable trade-off categories. And what I'm hearing you say is that by your evaluation in each of these trade-off category to category, you see the nodule mining as being superior. So we don't actually have to make necessarily trade-offs across categories. If I can put, if you agree with kind of that summary.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a pretty good way of putting it. I think that this is across almost all metrics, impact vectors, whatever you want to call it. It is better to take polymetallic nodules than it is to strip mine in terrestrial ecosystems, whether that's tropical rainforests or just forests or marshlands, for a bunch of reasons. I mean, one thing that we haven't talked about yet, but is a really big deal, is the generation of solid waste. And a lot of people don't appreciate this fact, but when you mine for nickel or copper or cobalt, wherever, you generate tremendous amounts of waste as you run that ore through processing stations. Usually 99% of what you're running through that is processed is waste, and that waste has to be treated and then stored safely, and it's at least semi-toxic when it's sitting in behind tailings dams, wherever the case may be. And that creates a lot of problems. Nodules don't create solid waste. So you're, instead of running, 100 tons of ore through to get 1 ton of metal, with nodules, you're running a ton of ore through to get a ton of finished products, whatever, the 7 different finished products.
So explain that a little bit, because people talk about nodules comparing ore grades to ore grades, and nodules are maybe I'm going to get this wrong, 4% nickel or something, compared to a lot of mines nowadays are kind of a tenth of that. But still, if it's only 4% nickel and 2% cobalt, like, you still have a lot of something left over. So what's that something that doesn't end up as waste?
Yeah, so a nodule generally breaks down into 80% low value material that'll probably end up in, potentially into steel markets, potentially into aggregates markets, but it's low value. 20% is high value material, whether that's nickel, copper, cobalt, manganese, titanium, rare earth minerals, whatnot. But it's 100% commercial.
So there's no.
It's just that 80% of it is low value, 20% of it is high value. When we run a nickel mine in Indonesia, 98.5% of what we bring to the high pressure acid leaching processing facility is going to end up as waste coming out the back end, because the nickel content is 1.5%. So that's a lot of energy that you're using to process a lot of stuff you're not going to use. But most problematic is the fact that you're generating massive quantities of solid waste, and it needs to go somewhere. So in Indonesia, they've had this debate: do we take that waste and do we pipe it out into the ocean and fill these deep caverns with this toxic waste? Because if you do, there are obviously some downsides to that, right? There are some real environmental impacts. What they decided, rather than do that, is that that was environmentally untenable, and the government they got a lot of protests when these producers were using that route. So they switched to tailings dams, despite the fact that local engineers in Indonesia said, this is really, really dangerous. Because of the seismicity in the region, because of the heavy rainfalls, the monsoons that come through there, because of the topography, which is, it's very hilly. These are disasters waiting to happen. And sure enough, you're seeing lots of tailings dam failures. I think in Indonesia there were already 3 this year. People die.
Right.
Lots of people are poisoned. You create these toxic floodplains that's never going to go away. There's wide areas that are spoiled. So you don't get that with polymetallic nodule because you don't have the waste problem, and you don't have the energy requirements that you have when you're processing a lot of waste in terrestrial mines. So waste is an area I think that people don't really pay attention to, gloss over, but it's a big deal. There were 9 tailings dam failures in the first 3 months of this year. Several people killed. I think the number is like 12 million people were subject to contaminated water in is it Zambia or Rwanda? I think it was Zambia earlier this year because of tailings dam failures. So these are real impacts that really affect people. And the fact that we could not have that if we were getting those minerals from nodules it's a really big deal.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. I guess one thing to say is that in some cases, what makes those tailings dangerous is the additives that were added during the processing process. So in Indonesian high pressure acid leaching, what is necessary in order to get the nickel out of the ore is a strong acid, often sulfuric acid, which is imported for that purpose. And that is kind of one of the things that makes the tailings dangerous. So I guess with nodules, it'll depend on the specific process as to whether or not we add in some things. But I'm hoping to have someone who's done some nodule processing work on to give us kind of more detail on that. The other thing, but I do think it's a really good point, and something that's often missed in these discussions is that a lot of the impacts from mining don't happen at the mine site. A lot of the impacts from mining happen at the initial and then downstream and then further downstream processing phases. And I think that that's something that also ought to be included in the deep sea mining conversation. It's one thing to get nodules up onto a boat, and then the question is kind of what do we do with them, and how does that compare also?
Yeah, so the processing, the solid waste is a big part of that. But another point along the same lines is that There are a lot of indirect impacts when you open up a terrestrial mine. In fact, the deforestation associated with opening a new terrestrial mine is shown in studies to be between 7 and 28 times the size of the actual mine's footprint. And that comes from all the infrastructure that you have to build around the mine, power lines, roads, rails, new communities, markets, agriculture to support. And that land use change often is permanent. So the footprint of a mine is one thing, but when you actually expand it to include some of these indirect impacts, it's much larger. So, one of the things that activists say is, well, and this is true. It takes around 3 times more land area to get a given level of mineral when you're taking it from the bottom of the ocean versus when you take it in a terrestrial source. Because in a terrestrial source, you're dealing with a 3D resource, right, where you dig down and there's actually some depth to it. So that's all true. There's 3 times more land required, but there aren't the indirect impacts with deep sea mining that you have with terrestrial mining. There are some. There's a plume, but we've shown already through scientific study that plume is not particularly dangerous or impactful to the organisms that live in the plume zone. But with terrestrial mining, you have these massive indirect impacts and all of the deforestation and the infrastructure that's built that make the mine much larger than its footprint. So when you weigh all those things, you actually see that the indirect impacts from terrestrial mining are much bigger than in nodule harvesting. So it's complicated, but that's why they do these life cycle analyses, and we point to 4 of them in our research, which show on multiple pathways that nodule harvesting is just creating fewer impacts and orders of magnitude. So these are not small differentials. There's a lot of savings when you take nodules.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I mean, I feel it's a little bit my job to say that a lot of these things, it depends on how you measure them. So you'll hear those same statistics being presented different ways, depending on, depending on what you include in your system boundary, and depending on what you include in your analysis. Like you're saying, if you include the indirect impacts, how indirect do you go? And then also what you're comparing. If you're comparing per ton of mineral, if you're being specific about the minerals, all of these things are kind of, the context matters, the details really matter. So, but I'll put, for people who are interested, we can put the life cycle assessments that you're referring to in the show notes, and people can go to that. There's also a recent paper it's a publication in NPJ Ocean Sustainability where they compare metal mining on land versus the ocean in the context of land use change, where they use different metrics, I think, and get different numbers. So it's just kind of worth it, I think, for people to look, to not just kind of take one source and say, well, this is the number that everyone agrees on, because you can get different people putting out different numbers, and often those numbers are all scientifically sound. They're just kind of doing their analysis in different ways. So then I guess there's a couple directions we can go here. One of the things I really want to get your insight on is kind of the role of investment, what it's like to be an investor in this space. And another direction, if we're on the topic of impacts, is kind of a lot of your publications and things on the website push back against some of the NGOs. And so
Sure.
We can talk specifically about those things now, or we can start with what it's like to be an investor. What are the things that I think, because I think for most people are kind of aware you need an investor somewhere in the picture, but they don't think very much about the details. And I'd really like to understand more of that.
Yeah. So, speaking as an investor here, first of all, it's important to know that investors, we have fiduciary responsibilities, right? So we have to do careful work and due diligence before making an investment, especially an investment in enterprises like this, because these are venture capital investments. These are early stage, high risk investments. Um, so a good investor spends a lot of time understanding I call it the short side of the story, or the negatives on a story. So before we got involved, we spent a lot of time understanding what could go wrong, what's bad about the industry, why won't it work, all of these questions. People generally don't just naively throw their money at projects like this, right? They make careful considerations of they try to understand what all the things that can go wrong. Um, they try to look at it in a negative light. They try to look at it like a short seller would, someone
Mm-hmm.
who's betting against the company. Because if it can stand up to that scrutiny, that's a good sign. That's maybe a company that you might want to invest in. So, we looked at all of that, right? We looked at the environmental impacts, of course. We looked at whether or not the economics really hold up. Does this have the potential to be a low cost source of minerals? That's a really, really important question to answer. The other thing is, when you're making venture style investments, you demand a high rate of return because you're taking so much risk.
Mm-hmm.
So that sets a high bar for these investments. So you really need to show that these investments are capable of producing some pretty attractive cash flows to make an investment in this sector. So, you know, people on the outside can, yap all they want about the fact that this can not be economic. There's no way this is economic, but it's really the people who put their money to work here who have a lot of information about the economics of these projects. They're the people that really matter at the end of the day, because that decides whether or not that ship gets built and whether that harvester gets put to work on the bottom of the ocean. So that's kind of the investor perspective, I'd say.
Yeah. So a lot of what you're doing then isn't just, I mean, it's easy to think of an investor's role as kind of money managing abstractly, but what you're saying, a lot of your role is really research and understanding, especially in this space where we're talking about something new. I heard you on the Rob Tyson's podcast kind of saying you've done a lot of modeling around some of these. And I thought, oh, well, that's interesting. Like, I don't know if you can describe in any more detail what kind of modeling is important, what kind of questions you ask beyond kind of what you've already said. And you also mentioned due diligence, and that made me wonder, like, if you don't do this well, are you exposed to some kind of liability if you get someone else's money and put it into a bad investment? Like, do you have more than just the return on investment motivating you to do this well?
Yeah, I mean, your job is kind of subject to your performance. So if you don't do your job well, it shows up in your numbers. And if you make silly investments in areas that make you look silly, you'll pay the price and you'll lose your job.
Mm-hmm.
So that's on the line for people. In terms of modeling, so I've modeled for a couple companies. There's really two sides of the equation: understanding the costs and then understanding kind of the business side, the revenues. The costs, I think, are pretty well nailed down by many of these companies at this point, to the point where they have contractors, people like Allseas or Transocean, who will literally give them a weekly rate or a monthly rate to harvest the nodules. So your costs are pretty well known. You know how much capital is going to be deployed roughly. You know the operational costs. What's more tricky is understanding the revenue side of the equation, and the reason that's tricky is that it goes back to processing. So in the initial stages of nodule harvesting, when you don't have optimized processing built out, you're going to be using some less than optimal solutions. So the question is, how conservatively do you model those revenues in those early years, based on the fact that you might only be pulling, 3 metals out of these nodules in a commercial way, deriving revenues from them. And then maybe it's 4, and then maybe it's 5, and eventually you get to the full suite of metals. And that's a tricky area, right? We know that you can process these nodules today, and there are a number of different ways to do that, and the way that you process these nodules is going to vary from one area to the next. The metals company is using, at least initially in the first stages, they'll use a pyrometallurgical process, and then later, I think it's a hydrometallurgical process. Um, but but there are other technologies that are emerging that could solve some of these issues as well. So it's a complicated area. It's an area that you've got some specialists out there. I'm sure you should probably get someone on your podcast to talk about it, because there's a lot going on there. But from an investor standpoint, what I care about is, okay, what's our worst case scenario in terms of processing, as we start this operation out? If I'm satisfied that we've got that modeled in, and the economics are still playing out here in a way that creates acceptable returns for me, then I'm okay with that project. But as an investor, I always want to see a kind of a conservative assumption underlying the investment model.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's helpful to get more of the details, I think, on that. I mean, it's interesting to me that you kind of raise processing as one of the big economic questions. I don't think I've heard that before. Um,
and to be clear, that there, people who are experts in processing, like Hatch, they can show you the steps that you can process these nodules, and it's not. I'm making it sound probably more uncertain than it is. Um, you can get those metals. The problem is that the way that the industry is set up right now, you might have to go to 2 or 3 processors, um, which creates costs, and ultimately you'll have that all done in one spot. And actually, nodules are easier to process than terrestrial minerals, in the sense that nodules from the CCZ or Japan or the Cook Islands, they're generally homogeneous. So you can build your processing plants around a specific level of mineral content, and whether you get those from this part of that area or that part of the area, they're going to come out roughly the same. So that enables you to optimize processing, which creates lower costs of processing. So, there are some really good things about the processing, as well as some tricks that still need to be probably solved for.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. That those are the things that I have also heard from experts, is that kind of every ore is different, and you need to tune a process to an ore. I mean, I have seen that the metals company basically ran their nodules through, I think, Sumitomo in Japan, and got a nickel copper matte out of it, and so that you can just kind of throw them into existing processes. But I take your point that if you've got a large potential for very homogeneous ore body, then that's definitely an advantage. One more question on the investment side is like, how different is investing in deep sea mining from anything else? I'm thinking of, in other junior mining companies where, they're doing mineral exploration. There's a lot of uncertainty about whether or not they'll find what they're looking for, whether or not they can build out what they're looking for in an economic, whatever framework. So is deep sea mining kind of starting from scratch, or does it jive well with other things?
I think it jives well with junior mining investment, but it's as you alluded to, the you're kind of weighting the risks differently. As you mentioned, when you're talking about a junior miner, you're poking holes in the ground and you're making guesses and assumptions about the resource that you've got there, and you're not sure. And it's only when you poke a lot more holes and then you start digging that you really find out what you've got. With nodule resource, you kind of know what you have. I mean, it needs to be better defined in a lot of places, but you see videos of it. It's sitting on the surface. There's much less risk on that particular plane, but the other risks from a regulatory standpoint, are greater often because no one's done it before. So that's what's held back TMC and others in international waters, the regulatory risk. Like so a lot of junior miners also face regulatory risk, but if they're in mining friendly jurisdictions, that risk is just not as important.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so yeah, the risks are they're all present there in the same way they are for junior mining, but they're just weighted differently. And you also have with junior mining, you have the risks of NGOs protesting and that the finding some rare species that is going to prevent your mine from going forward, and you have the same thing in deep sea mining.
Yeah. Yeah, interesting. Okay, so then let me pull you back into the controversial aspects of the topic. So, yeah, it seems like you said the one of the kind of roles that you've decided to take on in this COMRC organization that you've started is to basically try to counter some of the narratives that you see coming out of the NGOs, and you take pretty specific aim at some of them, specifically WWF. And I mean, we can get into this as much or as little as you're kind of interested in. I have two kind of main questions. So one is like, I found it a little bit surprising. Like, there's a difference between, getting things wrong, thinking that you're doing good when actually you're stopping what might be a better process, versus kind of the more nefarious, actively hindering something because you've got an interest in it. And you seem to paint WWF a little bit in that latter, which I'm sure a lot of people push back on. So I don't know what the right question here is. Maybe just like, what do you take that view? Like, do you think that they're being kind of just mistaken or nefarious?
Well, I think that there are probably, I don't know, 98% of the people who work at WWF who are completely, um, above the board and have good intentions and, think that, protesting against deep sea mining is the right thing to do for the world. Um, but I do think that there are some people there that they might not intend to do wrong by the world, but they have other interests at the forefront of their mind. And what I'm saying isn't really particularly surprising or speculative, because if you look at the history of WWF, there's a lot out there that's happened that indicates what I'm saying is true. They had to apologize several years ago for funding these eco guards in 6 different continents, I think, where they were paying people to arm themselves and paying for training for people who were going out and torturing villagers, raping and killing people, in an effort to protect WWF's protected areas. And WWF led a cover up of the situation, and the House Natural Resources Commission had them come in and testify and called them out for covering up their activities. So WWF doesn't have clean hands. I mean, they WWF admitted what they did was wrong. They came out and apologized for having done it. They apologized to the indigenous people. They apologized to society for what they had done. So they're they don't have clean hands. There was also an instance.
Let me. I don't really have the right journalistic training to do these kind of interviews, so I'm always a little bit nervous when people bring up specific things like this. WWF commissioned an independent third-party investigation on that, and that report is available online. And the findings of that can be looked into, but I don't know what to add there aside from that people can get more details on these things.
I'm sure there are different perspectives, but you can look at the totality of research out there. I've looked at that report as well. And yes, if WWF pays a group to come out and say, hey, what we did wasn't so bad, then that group's going to come out and say, hey, it wasn't so bad. But if you look at independent reviews, they might say something different. But regardless, my only point is, I mean, they came out and apologized for it. So they must admit to have done some wrong if they're apologizing to people for it. So my only point is that they don't have completely clean hands. There was an incident when the board of WWF met and said, we can't talk about this wreck of this oil tanker that killed all this wildlife because this is Shell and they're a paying client of ours, and that goes to the point here, which is that WWF takes a lot of money from corporate interests and wealthy donors who have corporate interests in mind as well. So they have a motivation here, and then when you throw on top of that the fact that when it comes to energy mineral extraction, I mean, the game is, in Central Africa, Indonesia, some places in South Africa. And you're not, I mean, let's put it this way. The DRC sued Apple for covering up these atrocities, right? For taking blood minerals, knowingly taking blood minerals and then trying to cover it up.
Mm.
Now, these are allegations. It hasn't been proven, right? But where's WWF? I mean, they're nowhere. Apple pays WWF. But if you look up, go Google, WWF and DRC cobalt, there's nothing out there. It's perhaps, one of the most egregious atrocities happening today in terms of, impacting, indigenous peoples and the environment. And WWF is nowhere. That's not my opinion. You can Google it and see that they're absolutely nowhere. But if you Google WWF and deep sea mining, they're all over it. So, your listeners can draw their own conclusions. My conclusion is that they can make money by running campaigns against deep sea mining. They can make money by not saying anything about what's happening in the DRC or Indonesia and some of these other places. And that matters. It's a massive, I call it a corporation. And I know it's not really a corporation because they don't have shareholders and they're not making profits to distribute to shareholders. But the U.S. part of WWF, I think, takes in about $470 million a year. I mean, this is there are 3 people from Goldman Sachs on their board. This is a sophisticated company, multinational company, to my reckoning. And these are just my opinions. And I don't think people are aware enough of what's happened in the past with respect to this organization, and I think what's happening today. The fact that they are willing to put out misinformation about deep sea mining, um, it just rubs me the wrong way.
Yeah, well, I feel like one of the, I mean, there's certainly a strong argument, which I've heard before around deep sea mining, is that unlike some of these other, if you take on any other established industry, you're going to be having, established people push back. And so deep sea mining is an easy cause to campaign on because there aren't really so many people. There's no one's uncle that works in deep sea mining that you're going to be threatening to put out of a job. Aside from the small number of startup companies that are into this.
I think Eric, that's a great point, and it's a point we made in one of our pieces, which is that WWF and Greenpeace and some of the others, they've come to represent the establishment. At the end of the day, they represent the establishment, and because we're trying to do something new here that threatens the establishment, right? You have vested economic interests that are threatened by a new low-cost method of bringing minerals to the market, that you're going to get a lot of pushback. And that's exactly what we've seen. But I think people need to understand that is, the panda is not out there just looking out for indigenous people and biodiversity. The panda has some real vested economic interests in doing what it's doing. And that explains to me, and this is my opinion, right? But that explains to me their actions and why they care so much about something that's not even happening, yet turned a blind eye to massive atrocities that are happening against nature and against humans in this world.
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess I wonder what the WWF perspective on this. I mean, like you can't fight every fight. So you're always going to be able to point to something that someone's not doing and saying, well, you're not doing everything, so you clearly have an incentive to not do that thing. And then I guess I'm a bit skeptical when you tie, the fact that someone is a funder of WWF and that someone also has an interest somewhere. That I feel like that game is a little bit easy to play, and I would like to think that people, even people who are high up at Goldman Sachs can, want to serve on the board of WWF and attempt to separate that from their interests because they see it as a good cause. But
yeah, I mean,
yep.
This is me theorizing, right? But it's circumstantial evidence, if you will. But you do have, a board member of WWF in the past saying, "Hey, look, we're not going to say anything about Shell. They're a big corporate donor, so we're going to ignore that environmental disaster." So there's precedence for that. But I can't tell you that I've sat in a WWF boardroom and had them say, "Hey, we can't say anything about Apple's activities in the DRC because they're a big partner of ours." So anyways, it gets very political, and it's just an opinion. So
then a less controversial question is how do you see the role of organizations like WWF? I've talked to CEOs of deep sea mining companies who say, yeah, we find them very frustrating, but we recognize that it's an important stakeholder in the process, and somebody ought to hold that role. So yeah, do you see this as like an important role and you want the best people doing it, or do you feel like for some reason in this case it's an unnecessary role to have?
No, I think it's absolutely necessary, and they do, provide a public good, but they need to be more balanced and more honest in their approach, and maybe a little more introspective about what they're actually doing, because I really do think that they're costing lives and they're costing biodiversity by the way they're handling energy minerals. But yeah, there are good NGOs out there, yeah, I'm not going to name them, but there are a number of NGOs that I've had conversations with them, and they completely get it. Um, I'll tell you this little anecdote. Early on, I met with someone at Pew, who was a very fair-minded individual and completely understood it. He said, "Look, I know that taking minerals from the abyssal plains is going to do a lot less damage than taking minerals from underneath tropical rainforests next to human populations. It's common sense. We all realize this, but our goal here is to make sure that this is done in the right way. That there are protected areas of the ocean, enough protected areas set aside, and that there is some pressure to mitigate impacts." That was perfect.
Mm.
I mean that seemed very appropriate. Then Pew took a different route, and they hired some new people, and this new person feels that it's a better game to kind of put out misinformation and take a hard line against deep sea mining. So there's a right way and a wrong way to deal with it. I'll give you another kind of example here where I think NGOs could really help. There are a number of different technologies out there for lifting nodules from the ocean bottom. Risers is probably the most famous one, which are the same techniques that we use in oil and gas industry. Risers have a drawback in that you're bringing up a lot of bottom water and a bottom sediment, and then you need to do something with that. So they'll put it back down the pipe, and then they have to pump it back down. The question is, do you release that sediment somewhere in the water column, or do you pump it down all the way down to the bottom of the ocean? Different companies will do it different ways. I think GSR is pumping it all the way down to the seafloor. TMC has moved the level of sediment release to 2,000 meters, so that they want to get comfort that release is not going to impact human food supplies, most importantly. But there are also methods of taking up nodules to the surface that don't require bringing large quantities of water and sediment up. Impossible metals. I know you had Oliver on recently talking about his technology. That's one way. They use skip lifts, basically large buckets, to bring up nodules. This is a technology that's been used in terrestrial mining and also in deep sea work in the past. Those skips, because they don't bring up large amounts of water and sediment, and whatever they do bring up can be brought right back down to the bottom without releasing it in the mid-water column, creates a lot less problems, I think, environmentally. Also probably uses less energy, has less points of failure. There's some really good arguments for pushing for that technology. And the NGO could be right in there saying, hey, you guys use the best technology out there because you can do this economically without having these impacts on the environment. And that's the way to go. That's a great role for NGOs. Mm-hmm. Let's be pragmatic. Let's be honest. Let's be open-minded. But let's not have these political agendas and ignore facts and ignore costs and benefits. So that's not helpful to anyone.
Are there NGOs pushing those kind of messages, and it's just that the ones kind of with the loudest speakers and the clearest, least nuanced message kind of get the most attention?
I mean, I can't say that I know everything that happens in the industry. I've not seen an NGO really actively participate with industry. I think that what you have is the biggest, baddest NGO in the world has taken a hard line and advocated for a moratorium, and that scares a lot of smaller NGOs off, and they don't want to be seen as doing anything that would counter what kind of the big bad NGO WWF says. So you don't get a lot of constructive dialogues with the NGOs as a result.
Let me ask about I guess the question goes to persuasion. So this is like a very polarized topic, and kind of to the point that people are expected to take a side the moment that they step in. Like one of the first questions that kind of people get asked is, "Are you for or against?" Um, and and I think one approach is to try to reach across the aisle and say, okay, we actually are very similar. We all want the same things. It's reasonable to have a difference of opinion. Let's talk about the details and try to resolve that. And another approach would be kind of the extreme. Those guys are wrong. Those guys are bad. So, I mean, frankly, I think I see you doing a little bit of both, but just more abstractly. Like, what do you see as the right way? What do you think is the most productive way to kind of get, if your goal is to get this industry to be accepted in the best way? How would you like to see the conversation evolve in the future?
Yeah, I would love to see a balanced conversation. I would love to see the NGOs take the vocal NGOs take a more reasoned approach where they look at costs and benefits, not just costs. That would be wonderful. In fact, there probably would be no commerce. There would be no. My organization wouldn't have started if they had a reasoned approach. So from the perspective of industry, these NGOs have their foot on the neck of industry and are trying to press down hard enough to keep the airflow from coming in. So, that's when you have the need to go out and push back and push back, in a pretty forceful manner, like I do, to get that foot to be released, or to get people to understand that that's not fair treatment, that's not good for society, that's not good for humanity. So it's not my wish to have to go and respond to these NGOs in the way that we do, but that they've felt the need to put a lot of misinformation out there, and so it deserves a good response. And the companies can't, as I said, they don't feel comfortable, at least directly responding to a lot of what happens from these NGOs. So yes, I'd love to have a more positive conversation and find ways to work together. That would be fantastic. So hopefully it does get there.
Okay, I see we're coming up against the end of our time here. So, is there anything else that you think is important to mention before we start to wrap up?
We didn't spend any time talking about the implications of the U.S. Trying to allow contractors to go into international waters under U.S. regulations. I think that's going to be really interesting to watch, to see what happens. And I hear arguments from both sides. I of course completely understand the frustration of TMC and others who are operating in the United Nations, or have been operating within the ISA's constructs for years and seen very little progress, right? And that's, I think that is largely driven by the fact that there are some countries out there that just don't want this to happen, because it's either against their economic interests or just because they don't really have a whole lot of interest in general and have been persuaded that you can get some virtue signaling value from opposing this. And that's not good for humanity. It's not good for the energy transition. It's not good for anyone, and it has frustrated these companies. So I don't blame TMC, and I don't blame the administration in the U.S. for responding the way they have done. But I also have a tough time predicting exactly how that's going to go, right? There I'm sure will be unintended consequences. So it all needs to be carefully thought out. But it will definitely be interesting to watch how that plays out, what China does, what kind of legal challenges are thrown out. It's going to be, it's always interesting in this sector.
Yeah, I know that. I mean, that is definitely maybe the most interesting thing happening in the space right now. And I mean, personally, I try to refrain from speculating on it because I just know so little and it's so early and it's so easy to, to either to jump on one or other bandwagon about it. But I'm certainly interested if you've got, I mean, as someone who seems to think and have a lot of information on this, like, are there any particular aspects that you feel that you're thinking about that maybe aren't getting a lot of airtime or concern? I mean, I think a lot of people, voice the ISA was too slow, and so it's only fair to go somewhere else. And then I think the main opposing narrative on that is this opens up the potential for kind of the dissolution of international law in a very important area. And so there's just this big risk around that. And I think those would be the two narratives that I see. And if you've got any kind of other ways of looking at it or things to consider, I'd be interested.
No, I think that the only thing I could add is that, that I think U.S. regulations U.S. is a good regulator. I don't think its regulations in this area are finalized. I think there's work to be done there, and we'll see how that goes because there's going to be some challenges there. And as I said, what is the response by some of these other nations who are interested in also going after these resources? And is it in the United States' best interest to have, kind of dissolve that multilateral effort to have jurisdiction over those resources? There's just a lot of questions, and I'm not smart enough to figure out the answers, but it'll be very interesting to watch.
Yeah, interesting that you say the regulations aren't finalized and there's a lot more to go there. I guess that's important. We're a little bit, especially in the news cycle lately, people are just used to assuming that Trump is going to sign an executive order and green light kind of whatever, and that process and those things are going to go out the window. And I suspect that's probably what a lot of people assume, given, once you read a couple of headlines, Trump signs deep sea mining executive order, people might already just kind of think, oh, well, Trump has just green lighted this, and the companies are heading out there right now to start mining.
Yeah, I mean, there's a will from the Trump administration, but there are potential obstacles in the way in the form of regulations and legal challenges. At least that's my understanding of the situation. So we'll see how that plays out. But there's clearly a lot of will behind it, and if there's enough will, there could be a way.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll have to see how it works.
Okay, well, then, thanks a lot for the conversation. It's been very interesting. You've got a lot of perspective here that I found helpful. And so, where would you send people? First of all, where should people follow you, your organization? And then if there's anywhere else that you would send people to get more information on deep sea mining that you think is a good information source, I try to pass that.
I mean, first of all, thank you for doing this podcast. I think it's probably very helpful to some people, and I know you've got a lot on your plate right now, so this is kind of it's a big effort for you. So thank you for doing it. in terms of information, we have a website and a Twitter feed, and we put content out, usually a couple times a month, bigger thought pieces, less frequently. Obviously you go to the ISA for a lot of information, and TMC makes a lot of filings. So those are really good areas to go to find information. And TMC has, great communications on their website. So those are a few of the sources, I guess.
What's your Twitter handle, and what's your website URL?
It's commerce_org is the Twitter handle, and commerce.org. ORG is the website.
And that's COMRC.
COMRC, exactly. Great. And we can put up a couple of our publications maybe on when you post this. There's a publication called the Deadly Moratorium, where we talk about the downsides of the moratorium against deep sea mining, which is a good in-depth report that references a lot of scientific literature, like all these life cycle analyses that people will find helpful.
Great. Yeah, we'll put links to that and anything else you think is helpful in the show notes. Okay, well then, Scott Vincent, thanks very much for your time today.
Thanks, Eric. Great talking to you.